Section 1, Introduction. The battle no one talks about. History loves grand victories. It celebrates massive armies, powerful empires, and battles where the outcome feels inevitable. But buried beneath those famous stories are conflicts so uncomfortable, so defiant of logic, that history quietly turns away from them. This is one of those battles. A moment where numbers should have decided everything. Yet somehow didn't. 500 Spartans stood against an army of 30,000 Persians. Not as a legend, not as a myth, but as a brutal, blood-soaked reality. On paper, this fight should never have happened. 30,000 soldiers represented an overwhelming force, endless resources, and the authority of one of the most powerful empires the ancient world had ever known. 500 men, no matter how disciplined or brave, should have been erased within hours. Any strategist, any historian, any ruler of the time would have dismissed the idea as suicide. And yet, the Spartans marched anyway. What makes this battle even stranger is how rarely it is discussed. It doesn't dominate textbooks. It isn't shouted from monuments or endlessly recreated in films. Instead, it exists in fragments, half-remembered accounts, and uncomfortable questions. Why would history downplay a moment where elite warriors shattered the illusion that sheer numbers guarantee victory? Why does this story feel deliberately pushed into the shadows? The answer lies in what this battle represents. It challenges the belief that power always wins. It exposes how discipline, terrain, and ruthless training can turn impossible odds into something far more dangerous than expected. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it reveals how empires prefer stories that reinforce their dominance, not ones that expose their vulnerability. For the Spartans, this was never about survival. They did not march expecting glory or praise. They marched because this was who they were raised to be. From childhood, they were taught that death in battle was not failure, but fulfillment. Facing impossible odds was not madness, it was purpose. Against them stood an army confident in its size, certain that resistance would collapse under its weight. But history rarely prepares us for moments when certainty breaks. What happened when these two forces collided was not a clean victory or a simple defeat. It was chaos, fear, and disbelief unfolding in real time. And by the time the dust settled, the world was left with a story so dangerous to accepted truth that it was easier to forget it than to explain it. To understand how 500 men forced an empire to bleed, we must first step back into a world where war was everything, and where Sparta was unlike any society the world had ever seen. Section 2. The world of ancient Greece. Before the clash, ancient Greece was not a single nation, but a fractured world of rival city-states, each fighting to survive, dominate, or simply endure. Mountains divided the land, seas separated ambitions, and loyalty rarely extended beyond city walls. Athens pursued knowledge, art, and naval power. Corinth thrived on trade and wealth. Thebes sought regional dominance through shifting alliances. But Sparta was something entirely different. While other Greek states debated philosophy or commerce, Sparta prepared for war. Politics in Greece were unstable and brutal. Alliances shifted quickly, treaties were temporary, and betrayal was common. Power was measured not only by land or wealth, but by how many men a city could place on the battlefield. Warfare was frequent, personal, and unforgiving. Every city understood that survival depended on strength, yet each chose a different path to achieve it. Sparta chose the path of total militarization. From birth, a Spartan's life was shaped by the state. Newborns were inspected, and those deemed weak were discarded without hesitation. Survival itself became the first test of worth. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families and placed into the agoge, a state-run training system designed to break individuality and rebuild loyalty to Sparta alone. Hunger, pain, and discipline were not side effects of training, they were the tools. This was not how the rest of Greece lived. In Athens, boys learned rhetoric and music alongside basic military skills. In many city-states, soldiers were farmers who took up arms only when war demanded it. Their lives revolved around homes, families, and civic duties. Spartan life revolved around combat readiness. Every meal, exercise, and lesson served a single purpose: creating soldiers who would not break. Sparta's political structure reflected this obsession. Two kings ruled simultaneously, not to prevent tyranny, but to ensure continuity in war. A council of elders enforced tradition and discipline, while individual ambition was suppressed for collective strength. Wealth meant nothing if it weakened unity. Luxury was discouraged. Equality among Spartan warriors was enforced through shared meals and shared hardship. To be Spartan was to belong entirely to the state. This relentless focus created a reputation that echoed across Greece. Spartan soldiers were feared not because of numbers, but because of consistency. They did not flee. They did not panic. They advanced in silence, shields locked, trusting the man beside them more than their own survival. Other Greek armies relied on courage in moments. Spartans relied on conditioning built over decades. As tensions rose across the region and larger empires looked toward Greek lands, most city-states hesitated, negotiated, or prepared defensively. Sparta did not hesitate. It never had. In a world where war was common but preparation was uneven, Sparta stood apart as a society engineered for one outcome. And when the clash with Persia loomed on the horizon, Greece would soon learn the difference between men who fought and men who were built to fight. Section 3. Persia. The superpower of the ancient world, the Persian Empire, was not simply a kingdom. It was the largest superpower the ancient world had ever witnessed. By the time it turned its gaze toward Greece, Persia stretched across 3 continents, from the Indus Valley to the edges of Europe, commanding unimaginable wealth, manpower, and resources. Its armies were not drawn from a single people, but from dozens of conquered nations, each forced to fight beneath the Persian banner. This diversity gave Persia numbers that no Greek city-state could dream of matching. The Persian war machine was designed for domination, not defense. Massive supply lines followed the army, ensuring food, weapons, and reinforcements never stopped flowing. Roads were built for speed, messengers moved with astonishing efficiency, and commanders answered directly to imperial authority. Where Greek forces relied on citizen soldiers, Persia relied on scale. Infantry, cavalry, archers, and elite guard units marched together, overwhelming enemies through sheer mass and pressure. Battles were won by exhaustion, fear, and inevitability. Against this force, the idea of resistance seemed absurd. Most nations surrendered without a fight, choosing survival over annihilation. Even powerful kingdoms bent the knee once they saw the size of the approaching army. And yet, standing at the edge of this unstoppable machine were 500 Spartans. No vast supply lines, no endless reinforcements, no allies waiting in reserve, just discipline, shields, and years of brutal training. From Persia's perspective, this was not a battle, but a delay, a minor obstacle to be crushed on the way to total conquest. Logic demanded a swift victory. Numbers guaranteed it. History seemed already written. But empires often misunderstand one thing: power does not always move in straight lines. The Persian army had never faced men who had been shaped for sacrifice, conditioned to fight without retreat, and taught that death was preferable to surrender. What looked impossible on parchment would soon be tested in blood, sweat, and steel. As the Persian forces advanced, confidence filled their ranks, certainty in their outcome absolute. They believed the world would once again learn the same lesson. Resistance was futile. They could not imagine that a handful of warriors would expose the limits of empire itself. The clash ahead was not just a battle of armies, but a collision between numbers and will. And in that collision, the world was about to witness something no superpower was prepared to understand. For the Persians, war was a calculation, an exercise in dominance refined over generations. For the Spartans, war was identity, duty, and destiny fused into one unbreakable code. This imbalance in perspective would soon redefine what strength truly meant on the ancient battlefield. When steel met flesh and formations collided, the Persian belief in inevitability would begin to fracture, revealing cracks no empire ever expects to see. And in those cracks, the legend of 500 Spartans would be carved, not as myth, but as warning. A reminder that even the greatest powers can bleed, and that certainty is often the first casualty of war. Section 4. The Spartans. Born, trained, and condemned to fight, a Spartan was never meant to live an ordinary life. From the moment of birth, destiny closed in with ruthless certainty. Spartan elders examined every newborn, judging strength with cold precision. Weakness was not pitied, and mercy was considered a threat to survival. Only those deemed fit were allowed to live, not as children of families, but as future property of the state. In Sparta, life did not belong to the individual. It belonged to war. At the age of 7, a Spartan boy was taken from his home and thrust into the agoge. This was not training in the modern sense. It was systematic deprivation. Hunger was constant. Pain was instructional. Fear was a lesson to be mastered, not avoided. Boys were beaten not for failure, but to teach endurance. They were encouraged to steal food, not to reward theft, but to sharpen cunning. If caught, punishment followed, not for stealing but for being careless. Survival itself became a skill. Friendship in the agoge was forged through shared suffering. Loyalty to fellow Spartans replaced loyalty to family. Individual identity dissolved into collective purpose. Every exercise, every hardship was designed to strip away hesitation. Spartans were trained to move as one, fight as one, and die as one. Retreat was unthinkable. Breaking formation was dishonor. Fear was an enemy more dangerous than any blade. By adulthood, a Spartan warrior was no longer a man in the common sense. He was a weapon honed over decades. Shield, spear, and body moved in harmony, guided by instinct drilled into muscle and bone. Spartans were taught that their shield protected not just themselves, but the man beside them. To drop it was not cowardice, it was betrayal. This belief created soldiers who trusted each other with absolute certainty, even in chaos. Death was not hidden from Spartans. It was discussed openly, expected, and respected. Mothers famously told their sons to return with their shield or on it. Glory did not come from survival, but from obedience to duty. To die fighting was not tragedy. It was fulfillment. This mindset forged warriors who did not measure battles by odds, but by honor. Compared to other Greek soldiers, Spartans were terrifyingly calm. Where others shouted, Spartans advanced in silence. Where others panicked, Spartans held formation. This psychological edge often broke enemies before swords even met. Facing Spartans meant facing men who had already accepted death long before the battlefield. By the time these 500 stood against Persia, they did not see themselves as outnumbered. Numbers meant nothing to men who had been prepared their entire lives for this exact moment. They were not heroes chasing legend. They were the product of a system that demanded sacrifice and delivered warriors without hesitation. Born without choice, trained without mercy, and condemned by design to fight until the end. Section 5. March toward certain death. The march toward the battlefield was not hurried, nor was it chaotic. It was deliberate, controlled, and eerily calm. 500 Spartans moved as they always had, shoulder to shoulder, shields steady, eyes forward. There were no speeches promising survival, no illusions of rescue, no false hope whispered along the ranks. Every man knew the truth. This march was unlikely to end with their return. Unlike other armies, the Spartans did not mask their fate. They understood the scale of what awaited them. 30,000 Persians stood ahead, backed by an empire that swallowed resistance whole. Any ordinary force would have turned back, delayed, or pleaded for reinforcements. The Spartans did none of these things. Their acceptance of death was not despair. It was clarity. As they advanced, villages and allies watched in silence. Some saw courage. Others saw madness. Mothers, elders, and fellow Greeks understood what this march represented. These men were not advancing toward victory as it was commonly defined. They were advancing toward sacrifice. And yet, there was no fear in their formation, only resolve. Hope existed among them, but it was not hope of survival. It was hope of impact. Hope that their stand would matter. Hope that their discipline would buy time, inspire resistance, or expose weakness in a seemingly unstoppable force. Despair hovered at the edges of thought, but Spartan training had taught them how to cage it. Emotion was acknowledged, then controlled. The terrain ahead mattered as much as the enemy. Narrow ground could neutralize numbers. Position could turn mass into confusion. Every step forward brought calculations, not panic. The Spartans did not romanticize death, but they did not flee from it either. They walked toward it with open eyes, bound by oath and identity. There were moments of silence during the march, long stretches where only the sound of armor and boots against earth could be heard. In those moments, each man confronted his own thoughts. Memories of childhood stripped away. Training endured. Brothers fallen in earlier wars. There were no prayers for mercy, only acceptance of purpose. This was the difference between the Spartans and the armies they faced. The Persians marched believing victory was inevitable. The Spartans marched knowing death was possible, even likely. That knowledge stripped fear of its power. A man with nothing to lose cannot be intimidated. A force that expects no rescue cannot be broken by threat. As the battlefield drew closer, the weight of what lay ahead did not slow them. It sharpened them. Every step reinforced the understanding that this moment was the culmination of their lives. Whatever happened next would define not only their fate, but how the world understood resistance itself. And so they marched on, not chasing glory, but embracing duty, toward a clash that history would struggle to explain. Section 6, when 500 faced 30,000. The battle begins. The battlefield was chosen with intent. Narrow ground, uneven terrain, and limited space where numbers could not fully breathe. For the Spartans, this was not luck. It was calculation. They positioned themselves where 30,000 bodies could not surround them, where chaos would favor discipline, and where every Persian advance would be forced into a killing funnel. As dawn broke, the silence was heavy, stretched thin by the distant movement of an army that seemed endless. From the Persian side, confidence filled the air. Ranks upon ranks formed behind banners and armor that glittered in the light. Commanders expected a quick collapse. 500 men were visible ahead, unmoving, silent, their shields locked, spears angled forward. There were no taunts, no gestures of defiance. Just stillness. It was unsettling. The Persians advanced anyway, certain that momentum alone would break what stood before them. The first clash came like thunder. Persian infantry surged forward, expecting the Spartans to buckle under pressure. Instead, they slammed into a wall of bronze and muscle. Spartan shields absorbed the impact, their formation barely shifting. Spears thrust in unison, precise and merciless. The front ranks of the Persian army fell almost instantly, bodies piling where they stood. Momentum died in seconds. Confusion followed. Persian soldiers pushed from behind, unaware of the slaughter ahead. Those in front tried to retreat but were crushed by their own ranks. The Spartans did not chase. They advanced slowly, methodically, reclaiming ground inch by inch. Every movement was deliberate. Every kill was efficient. Fear spread faster than orders. Archers attempted to break the formation from a distance. Arrows darkened the sky, but Spartan shields rose together, turning volleys aside. When gaps appeared, they closed. When pressure mounted, they rotated fresh men forward. This was not a brawl. It was controlled violence, executed by men who had trained for this exact moment their entire lives. Persian commanders adjusted tactics, sending waves to exhaust the Spartans. Again and again, bodies surged forward. Again and again, they were cut down. The narrow terrain erased the advantage of numbers. 30,000 men became irrelevant when only a fraction could fight at once. The Spartans understood this. The Persians learned it the hard way. Hours passed. The ground grew slick with blood. Armor weighed heavier. Arms burned with fatigue. Yet the Spartan line held. Their breathing remained controlled. Their formation intact. They did not shout. They did not celebrate. They worked. Every fallen enemy was another reminder that discipline could carve through chaos. From the Persian rear, disbelief began to spread. This was not supposed to happen. A small force was stalling an empire. Officers shouted commands, pushing harder, promising reward and punishment. But fear had already entered the ranks. Soldiers saw the bodies. They heard the sound of shields colliding, spears piercing flesh. The image of invincibility began to fracture. For the Spartans, there was no illusion of dominance. They knew this could not last forever. Fatigue would accumulate. Mistakes would come. But every minute they held mattered. Every advance repelled was another blow against inevitability. They were not fighting for conquest. They were fighting for time. As the sun climbed higher, the battlefield told a story no one expected. The strongest empire in the world was bleeding, stalled by 500 men who refused to break. This was the moment where myth and reality collided, where logic failed, where the idea of impossible odds was tested and found wanting. The battle had begun as a calculation. It was becoming something else entirely, a lesson written in blood. And as the Persians regrouped for their next assault, one truth was impossible to ignore. This was no longer a simple clash of armies. It was a confrontation between numbers and will had not yet yielded. Section 7. How the Spartans did the impossible. What the Spartans achieved on that battlefield was not magic, luck, or blind bravery. It was the result of a system refined over generations, a method designed to turn discipline into a weapon sharper than any blade. The secret was not that they were stronger than the Persians, but that they fought in a way the Persians were never prepared to counter. At the heart of Spartan success was formation. The phalanx was not just a line of soldiers. It was a living structure. Shields overlapped, spears projected outward, and every man trusted that the warrior beside him would hold. This trust eliminated hesitation. While Persian soldiers fought as individuals within a massive crowd, Spartans fought as parts of a single body. When pressure came, the formation absorbed it. When an opening appeared, the formation exploited it instantly. Terrain amplified this advantage. The Spartans deliberately chose ground that narrowed the battlefield, stripping the Persians of their greatest strength, numbers. In tight spaces, thousands meant nothing if only dozens could engage at once. The Persian army, used to overwhelming enemies with mass and mobility, found itself compressed, unable to maneuver, retreat, or flank effectively. The battlefield itself became a Spartan ally. Discipline was the invisible force that held everything together. Spartan warriors did not rush forward driven by emotion. They advanced slowly, maintaining spacing, conserving energy, and striking only when the moment demanded it. When the front ranks tired, they rotated backward, replaced seamlessly by fresh men. There was no panic, no breakdown, no gaps left exposed. This constant renewal allowed a small force to fight far longer than logic would allow. Psychological warfare played an equally critical role. Spartans fought in near silence, their calm presence deeply unsettling. They did not shout victory cries or roar threats. Their quiet advance sent a clear message. Fear lived on the other side of the shields. Persian soldiers, many drawn from conquered lands and forced into service, were not prepared to face enemies who showed no emotion and no mercy. Each failed assault eroded morale faster than casualties ever could. Spartan training also removed fear of death from the equation. A man who accepts death cannot be intimidated. Threats of punishment, promises of reward, and displays of power meant nothing to warriors who had been conditioned since childhood to value honor over survival. While Persian soldiers fought because they were ordered to, Spartans fought because it was their identity. This difference transformed combat from a contest of numbers into a test of resolve. Leadership further reinforced this edge. Spartan commanders fought alongside their men, sharing risk rather than directing from safety. Orders were simple, direct, and instantly obeyed. There was no confusion, no hesitation waiting for commands to filter through massive ranks. In contrast, Persian officers struggled to control chaos as fear spread and formations collapsed under pressure. Most importantly, the Spartans understood their objective. They were not trying to annihilate the Persian army. They were trying to hold, to delay, to bleed confidence. Every minute the Persians were stalled weakened the illusion of inevitability. This clarity prevented reckless decisions. The Spartans did not chase retreating enemies or overextend. They held their ground and forced the Persians to come to them again and again. This was how the impossible became possible. Not through raw strength, but through precision. Not through numbers, but through unity. The Spartans transformed their limitations into advantages and exposed the weakness hidden inside overwhelming power. And as the battle dragged on, one truth became undeniable. The Persians were learning that numbers alone could not win this fight. But time, exhaustion, and betrayal still loomed ahead, waiting for the moment when even the strongest discipline would be tested to its breaking point. Section 8. Betrayal, blood, and the turning point. Every battle has a moment when balance shifts, when momentum slips through blood-stained fingers and certainty collapses into chaos. For the Spartans, that moment did not come from the front lines, but from behind. What discipline and courage had held together for hours would now be tested by something far more dangerous than numbers: betrayal. Somewhere beyond the clash of shields and spears, knowledge changed hands. The Persians learned of a path, a way around the narrow ground that had neutralized their army. What had been a fortress of terrain was suddenly vulnerable. The realization spread quietly at first, then with terrifying clarity. The Spartans were about to be surrounded. As the Persian forces moved to exploit this weakness, the battlefield grew darker. Attacks intensified. Waves came faster, more desperate, driven by renewed confidence. The Spartans felt the shift immediately. Pressure increased. Fatigue deepened. Bodies that had been pushed back now stayed down. Blood soaked into the earth until footing itself became uncertain. Losses mounted. Familiar faces fell. The formation tightened not out of strategy, but necessity. Every fallen Spartan meant more ground to cover, more weight on the remaining shields. And yet, even now, there was no retreat. The line bent, but it did not break. Not because survival was possible, but because surrender was unthinkable. The knowledge of encirclement carried a different kind of weight. Hope of holding indefinitely vanished. The battle was no longer about delay alone, it was about choice. Fight on and die standing, or flee and live in disgrace. For Spartans, this was no decision at all. Death had always been the price. As Persian forces pressed from multiple directions, chaos threatened discipline itself. Orders had to be shouted. Movements became harder to coordinate. The silence that once unsettled the enemy was replaced by the brutal sounds of close combat. Steel struck steel. Men screamed. The illusion of control began to crack. Yet even in this collapse, the Spartans refused panic. They adapted, compressing their formation, turning outward to meet threats from every side. Every movement was slower now. Every strike cost more. But their resistance did not vanish. It hardened. The Persians may have found a path around the Spartans, but they had not found a way through their resolve. This turning point marked the beginning of the end, but not the end itself. The Spartans knew what was coming. There would be no rescue, no reversal, only a final stand against inevitability. And still they fought. In this moment of betrayal and blood, the battle transformed. It was no longer about winning or losing. It became a statement written in sacrifice. A declaration that even when surrounded, even when broken by circumstance, there are forces that refuse to yield. And as the battlefield closed in on them, the Spartans prepared to face their fate head-on, determined that the world would remember not how they fell, but how long they stood. Section 9. The Aftermath. Victory, loss, and silence. When the fighting finally ended, the battlefield no longer resembled a place of strategy or heroism. It was a landscape of bodies, broken weapons, and silence. For the Persians, the path forward eventually opened, but it came at a cost far heavier than expected. They had not been stopped forever, but they had been exposed. An empire built on inevitability had been forced to bleed for every step. From a strategic perspective, Persia could still claim progress. The Spartans were gone. The road lay open, yet victory felt strangely hollow. Thousands had fallen to a force that should have been erased within hours. Word of the battle traveled quickly through the ranks, carried not with pride, but with unease. Soldiers spoke of disciplined men who did not flee, who did not beg, and who fought until there was nothing left to give. The myth of Persian invincibility had cracked. For Greece, the loss was devastating and transformative at the same time. 500 Spartans were gone, men who would never return home. Families mourned in silence, fully aware that this outcome had been expected from the beginning. There were no celebrations, no illusions of triumph. And yet, something profound had been achieved. The battle proved that Persia could be resisted, that numbers were not destiny, that empire was not untouchable. This psychological shift mattered more than territory. Greek city-states that once hesitated now reconsidered. Courage spread faster than fear. The Spartans had not saved Greece alone, but they had changed how Greeks viewed their enemy and themselves. Their sacrifice bought time, inspiration, and belief. These were weapons no army could measure, but every empire feared. And still, history did not elevate this battle to the prominence it deserved. It did not fit comfortably into neat narratives of conquest or glory. The Spartans did not win in the traditional sense, and empires rarely celebrate moments that reveal weakness. Over time, the story was simplified, softened, or pushed aside in favor of cleaner victories and clearer heroes. Silence settled over the battlefield, then over the centuries that followed. What remained were fragments, accounts that hinted at something extraordinary but never fully explained it. The truth was inconvenient. 500 men had stood against 30,000 and forced the world to reconsider what strength truly meant. Triumph and tragedy became inseparable in the aftermath. The Spartans lost their lives, but their stand reshaped history's direction. Persia advanced, but it did so wounded and wary. This duality is why the battle is so often overlooked. It resists simple labels, cannot be framed as total victory or total defeat. And perhaps that is why it matters. Because in that silence lies a reminder that some of the most powerful moments in history are not the ones shouted from monuments, but the ones quietly buried, waiting for someone to ask why they were forgotten at all. Section 9. The Aftermath. Victory, loss, and silence when the fighting finally ended. The battlefield no longer resembled a place of strategy or heroism. It was a landscape of bodies, broken weapons, and silence. For the Persians, the path forward eventually opened, but it came at a cost far heavier than expected. They had not been stopped forever, but they had been exposed. An empire built on inevitability had been forced to bleed for every step. From a strategic perspective, Persia could still claim progress. The Spartans were gone. The road lay open, yet victory felt strangely hollow. Thousands had fallen to a force that should have been erased within hours. Word of the battle traveled quickly through the ranks, carried not with pride, but with unease. Soldiers spoke of disciplined men who did not flee, who did not beg, and who fought until there was nothing left to give. The myth of Persian invincibility had cracked. For Greece, the loss was devastating and transformative at the same time. 500 Spartans were gone, men who would never return home. Families mourned in silence, fully aware that this outcome had been expected from the beginning. There were no celebrations, no illusions of triumph. And yet, something profound had been achieved. The battle proved that Persia could be resisted, that numbers were not destiny, that empire was not untouchable. This psychological shift mattered more than territory. Greek city-states that once hesitated now reconsidered. Courage spread faster than fear. The Spartans had not saved Greece alone, but they had changed how Greeks viewed their enemy and themselves. Their sacrifice bought time, inspiration, and belief. These were weapons no army could measure, but every empire feared. And still, history did not elevate this battle to the prominence it deserved. It did not fit comfortably into neat narratives of conquest or glory. The Spartans did not win in the traditional sense, and empires rarely celebrate moments that reveal weakness. Over time, the story was simplified, softened, or pushed aside in favor of cleaner victories and clearer heroes. Silence settled over the battlefield, then over the centuries that followed. What remained were fragments, accounts that hinted at something extraordinary but never fully explained it. The truth was inconvenient. 500 men had stood against 30,000 and forced the world to reconsider what strength truly meant. Triumph and tragedy became inseparable in the aftermath. The Spartans lost their lives, but their stand reshaped history's direction. Persia advanced, but it did so wounded and wary. This duality is why the battle is so often overlooked. It resists simple labels, cannot be framed as total victory or total defeat. And perhaps that is why it matters. Because in that silence lies a reminder that some of the most powerful moments in history are not the ones shouted from monuments, but the ones quietly buried, waiting for someone to ask why they were forgotten at all.